was still smiling when the sheriff came to the door. The same smile he used every time he lied to me. The roses were blooming behind him, bright, perfect, red as his lies. I didn't say a word. I just watched as the truth finally caught up to him. The air that morning was thick with heat and jasmine. I remember the hum of bees in the hedge, the soft scrape of gravel under the sheriff's boots as he climbed the porch. He took off his hat when he saw me. Habit, not pity. 2 deputies waited by the patrol car, its engine still running, a low growl in the distance. Frank stood in the doorway in his press shirt, hair combed neat like Sunday service. To anyone else, he looked like a man with nothing to hide. But I'd learned long ago, clean collars don't mean clean hearts. "Mrs. Beaumont," the sheriff said, his voice polite but certain, "you might want to step inside." Frank gave me that same easy grin, the one he'd used on bankers, neighbors, women at church socials. "Clara," he said softly, "it's all a misunderstanding. I'll take care of it." But I didn't move. My hands were still damp from watering the garden, soil clinging beneath my nails. The hose lay coiled at my feet, forgotten. The bees kept moving through the roses, steady, patient, like they'd been waiting for this. When the cuffs clicked, Frank's eyes flickered. First confusion, then something smaller, meaner, fear, maybe. It passed quick, the way light dies in a storm. He turned to me once more, expecting a word, a plea, some sign that I'd save him again. I only looked back, long enough for him to see that whatever power he had over me had gone quiet. The sheriff guided him down the steps. The porch boards creaked, the same sound they'd made for 40 years. The morning light hit his shoulders as he passed beneath the roses he'd once planted for me, back when apologies came in flowers instead of words. I never thought justice would sound like silence. But to understand how it all began, you'd have to know what was buried beneath those roses long before they bloomed. It started like any other morning. The air smelled of honeysuckle and damp earth. The kind of morning that looks gentle from a distance, before you know what it's bringing. I opened the kitchen window and let the light spill across the counter over the 2 coffee cups waiting there, one for him, one for me. I still filled both out of habit. Frank always said he liked his coffee strong, but he never drank it until it cooled. I used to think that meant patience. Now I know it meant distraction. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock and the faint rustle of the curtains. 40 years in the same walls, and I still noticed how sound carried, how the floorboards held a memory of every step. Outside, the roses had gone wild again. The rain the night before had pulled half the petals down, and the rest hung heavy, defiant. My mother's roses. She used to say that tending them was like keeping promises. You could ignore them for a while, but neglect always shows itself in time. I put on my gloves and stepped into the yard. The ground was soft under my shoes. Bees murmured low in the blooms, and the air felt alive with small secrets. That's when I saw it. A corner of white under the stepping stone near the fence. Not much, just the edge of a folded paper, the kind that doesn't belong outside. I almost walked past it. Almost. But something in me stopped. I knelt, brushed away a bit of dirt, and lifted the stone. The paper was damp but still legible. A bank statement. Our bank. My name printed neatly at the top. The balance lower than it should have been. Withdrawals I hadn't made. Signatures I didn't recognize but somehow did. My first thought wasn't anger. It was clarity. The kind that slides in quiet, like a door you didn't know was open. I sat back on my heels and looked around the garden. The sunlight, the small green shoots, the life pushing through despite everything. The house behind me looked as steady as ever, but the stillness felt wrong now, like a held breath that had gone on too long. Inside, a floorboard creaked. I heard the shower running upstairs, the faint rhythm of water on tile. Frank was awake. I folded the paper once, twice, and slid it into my pocket. Then I went back to cutting the dead stems from the roses, careful not to bleed. When he came down half an hour later, his hair was damp, his aftershave sharp enough to sting the air. He kissed my cheek. Habit, nothing more. "Morning, sweetheart," he said. "You're up early." "I was in the garden," I told him. He smiled at that. "Those roses are the only thing holding this place together." He sat, poured his coffee, and began to talk about the neighbor's dog, about bills, about everything that didn't matter. I watched his hands as he spoke, how steady they were, how they'd signed my name without trembling. I didn't mention the paper. Not yet. There are moments when truth is like fruit. You don't pick it until it's ready to fall. Later that morning, I slipped the statement back under the stepping stone. Not out of fear, out of patience. The truth, I told myself, would ripen soon enough. The afternoon settled over the house like a held breath. The light slanted across the kitchen floor, broken by the shadows of the blinds, a slow shifting pattern that moved with the sun. It was quiet. So quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of flies against the window screen. The house always sounded louder when I had something to hide. Frank had finished his breakfast hours ago. Now he was in the den, the television low, his glass of iced tea clinking when he moved it from one coaster to another. Some news anchor was droning on about an election, about people neither of us would ever meet. The volume rose and fell, not enough to drown out the silence between us, just enough to make it harder to think. I stood at the sink, rinsing the same 2 cups I'd already washed. It wasn't about cleaning. It was something to do with my hands. The warm water ran over my fingers until they wrinkled, until my mind quieted enough to keep from circling back to the paper under the stone. Through the reflection in the window, I could see Frank's shape, his shoulders square, his posture careful, as if life itself were a performance that needed rehearsing. The sight of him used to steady me. Now it made me tired. There was a time when I would have looked at that figure and seen safety, but I'd learned that certainty can be just another kind of cage. He called out from the den, his voice casual, already halfway to irritation. "Did you pay the power bill?" "Yes," I said, though we both knew he'd already done it. He made a sound, half grunt, half sigh, and the television volume went up another notch. I dried my hands and listened to him move around. The heavy steps, the creak of the leather chair, the familiar rhythm of a man settling into control. 40 years in this house, and I knew its moods as well as I knew his. I could tell when a hinge needed oil, when the roof was ready for patching, and when Frank was pacing instead of walking. He paced when he was planning, and Frank was always planning something. That evening, we sat down to dinner like we always did. 2 plates, 1 napkin folded just so, his seat at the head of the table. He spoke without looking at me, his fork scraping against the plate. "They're saying gas might go up again," he said. I murmured. "People blame the government for everything," he added, stabbing at his meatloaf. "No one takes responsibility anymore." He meant it as a philosophy, but the words sat between us like a dare. I let them pass, pushing my peas into small, perfect rows. The conversation thinned. We'd mastered that kind of silence over the years, the practiced calm of people who know that speaking honestly can break more than it heals. After dinner, he went to his study, leaving behind the faint scent of aftershave and whiskey. I began clearing the table. The small sounds became my company. The clink of plates, the hum of the refrigerator, the steady heartbeat of the clock in the hall. That old clock had been my mother's, its pendulum still ticking away the years I couldn't get back. When everything was clean, I sat by the window with my journal. The pages smelled faintly of ink and dust. It had been months since I'd written anything, but the words came slow and sure, like the first rain after drought. He lies with such ease that truth feels like interruption. Silence is safer, but safety is not peace. I looked up from the page when I heard his footsteps. He stood in the doorway with a drink in his hand, the ice cubes melting fast in the evening heat. "You still writing those little poems?" he asked, his tone more curious than cruel. "They're not poems," I said. He smiled, that half smile that never reached his eyes. "You always had a way with words. Shame you never did anything with it." I met his gaze and said, "Maybe I did." He frowned, not sure if I was joking. I didn't clarify. He lingered a moment longer, then turned and went upstairs, his footsteps fading down the hall. When I was sure he'd gone to bed, I opened the back door and stepped into the garden. The air outside was cool and damp, the kind of night that carried sound softly. Crickets sang in the grass, and the roses were dark against the fence, their scent heavy and alive. I walked barefoot across the yard until I reached the stepping stone. The earth around it was still loose from the morning. I knelt, lifted the stone, and ran my fingers over the edge of the folded paper beneath. It was still there, proof of something unspoken, pulsing quietly beneath the surface of my life. I whispered, "I see you," though I didn't know whether I meant the paper, or him, or the woman I used to be before all this. The moon hung pale above the house, lighting the petals silver. From here, the windows looked warm and ordinary. No one would guess what was hidden in that neat little home. I wondered if anyone ever does. For a moment I thought about burning the paper, ending the suspense before it took root in me. But I didn't. I couldn't. The truth, once found, asks to be kept, like a living thing. I stayed there until my knees ached, until the night sounds began to fade. Then I pressed the stone back into place, brushing the dirt from my palms. When I went inside, the house greeted me with its stillness. I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the dark. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the steady tick of the clock, the sound of Frank's distant snore, all of it folded together into a strange kind of harmony. Silence wasn't empty. It was full of every word we hadn't said, every glance that lasted too long, every lie that never had to be spoken out loud. I went upstairs and paused at the doorway to our room. Frank was asleep, one arm hanging off the side of the bed, his face turned toward the window. The moonlight softened the lines on his face, made him look almost kind again. Almost. I lay down beside him, but didn't close my eyes. I watched the faint rise and fall of his chest, the small twitch of his fingers. I wondered if he dreamed of anything honest. The night felt long and still, and in that stillness something inside me shifted. A quiet understanding that whatever this marriage was, it had already ended. We were just pretending not to notice. The clock downstairs struck 11, then 12. I lay there, awake, waiting for morning. Morning crept in like a secret. The first light brushed across the curtains, pale and tentative, turning the dust in the air to gold. Frank was still asleep beside me, breathing heavily, his arm thrown over the blanket in careless ownership. I watched him for a moment, that familiar face softened by sleep, and tried to feel what I used to. Nothing came. I slipped from the bed without a sound and went downstairs. The house was cool, the air thick with last night's silence. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. Every shadow was exactly where I'd left it. I filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and stood there listening to it warm. Outside, the roses glowed faintly in the half-light, their shapes blurred by morning fog. The garden looked almost kind at that hour, like it was willing to keep my secrets for another day. I poured my coffee, sat at the table, and opened my journal. The pages smelled faintly of earth from where I'd carried it outside the night before. I wrote without thinking. He lies in peace beside me, while the truth lies buried in the garden. Maybe silence is what marriage becomes when love goes to seed. I stared at those words for a long time. They didn't feel dramatic or cruel. They felt ordinary, like something that had been true for years, only now finding its voice. Upstairs, I heard the pipes creak. Water started running. Frank was awake. The sound made me close the notebook. My hand lingered on the cover before I slid it under a stack of old magazines. When he came down, I was already washing the dishes I hadn't dirtied. He kissed my shoulder like he always did. a brush of habit more than affection. "Morning," he said. His voice had that easy calm again, the kind that used to convince me he was right, even when I knew he wasn't. "Morning," I answered. He glanced at the stove. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep." He smiled as he poured his coffee, still unaware of the space between us widening by the hour. "You worry too much. Everything's fine." "Is it?" I asked softly, but he didn't hear, or didn't want to. He took his mug and went out to the porch, humming a tune I couldn't place. I watched through the window as he settled into his chair, content as ever, the newspaper folded neatly on his lap. From here, you'd never know what hid beneath that polished calm. When he left for town, the silence returned, and I let it breathe. I walked through each room slowly, taking in the life we'd built. Every photograph on the wall looked like proof of something that had already faded. Our wedding portrait, the family trip to Savannah, Eli at 10 holding the fish he'd caught, all frozen smiles, all ghosts. I ended up back in the garden. The morning fog had lifted, and the roses were bright again, heavy with dew. I knelt by the stepping stone, brushed the dirt from its edge, and traced the faint crack running through it. It hadn't been there before. I lifted the stone and took out the folded paper, my name at the top, the forged signature underneath. I read it again and again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder. But they didn't. I pressed my thumb over the ink, leaving a smudge that was more honest than the name beside it. Then I folded the paper and set it back down, pressing the stone gently into place. A breeze moved through the roses, scattering a few loose petals onto the grass. Red against green, vivid and alive. I thought about cutting them back again, but something in me resisted. Maybe they needed to grow wild for a while, to see what shape they'd take when left alone. By late afternoon, the sky darkened with clouds. I sat on the porch with my journal, listening to thunder roll in the distance. The air smelled of rain and copper. When the first drops began to fall, I wrote, "Patience is not forgiveness. It's waiting until the storm has finished choosing sides." The rain came harder. The roses bent under the weight of it, and for a moment I thought one of the stems might snap, but it didn't. They just bowed lower, as if surrendering was another way to endure. Inside, the phone rang once, then stopped. I didn't answer. Frank would when he came home. He always did. He liked to control who spoke and who stayed silent. But the quiet I was learning now, it wasn't submission. It was preparation. When the storm passed, I stepped out into the wet grass. The sky had broken open into soft gray light. The air was heavy and new. I breathed it in, slow and steady, and realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Something in me had shifted again. Small, invisible, but real, like the sound of a seed splitting open beneath the soil. I looked at the roses one last time before going inside. Their petals were torn and shining, clinging stubbornly to the stems. They'd survive the rain. They always did. I dried my hands, made myself another cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table until the light faded completely. When Frank came home that evening, talking about traffic and weather, I listened quietly, nodding at the right moments. But the space between his words felt wider now, impossible to ignore. He didn't notice. Men like him rarely do. That night, as we turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, I touched the wall along the staircase. The same wall I'd painted years ago. The same one that still carried faint scratches from Eli's childhood toys. It felt different now, solid and cold. But it was mine. In bed, Frank drifted to sleep quickly, his breathing slow and deep. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint glow of passing headlights. Somewhere outside, the garden whispered with wind. The truth was still buried. But I could feel it moving. The phone rang just after noon. A bright, ordinary sound, innocent enough to belong anywhere. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and reached for it, thinking it might be Eli calling. But when I lifted the receiver, I heard Frank's voice first. He was in his study, door half closed. He hadn't noticed that the kitchen phone still shared the same line. His voice was low, warm, the kind he used when he wanted to sound kind instead of clever. "I told you I'd handle it," he was saying. "You just need to trust me, Nancy. Everything's gonna be fine." A woman's voice murmured something I couldn't catch. Her tone was soft, hesitant. Frank chuckled, that easy laugh I used to love because it made people feel safe. "I'll stop by tomorrow," he said. "You shouldn't worry about the paperwork. I'll take care of that myself." There was a pause, then the sound of her breath, one short, nervous sigh, and the line went dead. I stood there with the receiver in my hand, the dial tone humming through my fingers. The name sat in my mind like a stone dropped into water. Nancy. No title, no last name. Just Nancy. I replaced the phone slowly, afraid it might make a sound loud enough to break the illusion of calm that lived in this house. My hands were cold. I went back to the sink, turned on the tap, and let the water run until it grew warm again. When Frank came out of the study a few minutes later, his face was composed, his tone easy. "Heading into town," he said, slipping his wallet into his jacket pocket. "For what?" I asked. "Bank stuff, you know. Boring errands." He leaned in and kissed the top of my head before I could move away. The smell of his cologne followed him out the door. The house felt larger once he was gone, like his absence had given the walls permission to breathe. I stood there listening to the emptiness. Then I went to the window and watched his car back down the drive, dust curling up behind it like smoke. That night, I dreamed of my mother. She was standing in her garden, the same patch of roses I tended now. She was younger than I remembered, her hair pinned up, her hands strong and steady. She looked at me and said, "Don't let silence become your home." When I woke, the pillowcase was damp with tears I didn't remember shedding. The next morning, after Frank left for his usual breakfast at the diner, I went into his study. The air inside was stale, faintly sweet with the smell of whiskey and old paper. His desk was perfectly arranged, bills stacked in neat piles, checkbook open to a page filled with his looping signature. I scanned the names. Most were familiar, but one wasn't. Nancy Lee. Her name appeared twice, written in Frank's careful hand beside two amounts that didn't belong to charity. I copied it onto a slip of paper and slid it into my pocket before putting everything back exactly where it had been. Frank never suspected me of curiosity. He believed I had outgrown it, like an old dress that no longer fit. That afternoon, I called the florist downtown. I asked if they knew a woman named Nancy Lee. The girl on the line said, "Oh, sure. She's that widow on Ashford Road. Lost her husband last year. Sweet lady." "Widow?" I repeated, though my voice hardly sounded like mine. "Yes, ma'am. She's been fixing up her husband's old place. Mr. Beaumont's been helping her, I think. Everyone says he's been such a blessing." "Everyone," I said. "Right." I thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence. The kitchen clock ticked steadily behind me, measuring out each second as if to prove time hadn't stopped. Later, when Frank came home, he was cheerful. He tossed his keys onto the counter and said, "Ran into that kid who does our yard. I told him we'll need new mulch next week." I nodded. He smiled. "You're quiet today." "Just tired," I said. That night, he slept soundly. I didn't. I kept hearing my mother's voice, soft as wind through the trees. "Don't let silence become your home." The next morning, I dressed neatly, put on my sun hat, and told Frank I was heading to the nursery for rose feed. He didn't ask questions. Why would he? He thought I'd stopped being curious a long time ago. Ashford Road was only 10 minutes away. The drive was quiet, the radio playing something slow and sentimental. The kind of music you hum along to when you're pretending not to think. Nancy's house was small, white, set back behind a low fence lined with marigolds. She was in the yard when I pulled up, wearing gloves and a wide-brimmed hat. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, the way women do when they recognize someone who understands work done by hand. "Beautiful day," I said. "It is," she replied, brushing soil from her palms. "Are you here about the lilies?" "I've got a few extra bulbs." We talked for a few minutes about the weather, the drought, the stubborn weeds that refused to die. Her voice was gentle, unguarded. There was nothing deceitful about her, just loneliness dressed up as grace. After a while, she said, "You remind me of Frank's wife. He said she gardens, too." I felt something twist in my chest. "Does he talk about her often?" "Oh, not much," she said. "Only that they've been apart for a while. He said she wanted space." "I suppose that happens," I nodded. "It does." She smiled at me kindly, as if she were offering understanding. "He's been a blessing, truly. Helped me sort through my husband's papers. I don't know what I would have done without him." I thanked her for her time and bought a small potted fern I didn't need, just to make the visit look ordinary. Driving home, I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on the pot beside me. The fern's leaves trembled with each bump in the road, delicate and green, still too young to know anything about lies. By the time I reached the house, the sun was high and merciless. I parked, carried the plant inside, and set it on the counter. Its roots were bound too tight in its pot. It would need more space to grow. I stood there for a long time, the truth spreading quietly through me like water through soil. Frank's world was smaller than he believed, and I was no longer trapped inside it. When he came home that evening, I greeted him the same way I always had, with a calm smile and dinner ready on the table. He talked and I listened, but my silence was no longer the same. It wasn't the silence of surrender. It was the silence of gathering. Ashford Road looked different the second time I drove it. The first time, I was polite, curious, cautious, careful not to be seen. But the second time, the air felt heavier, charged with something unnamed. The same wind that moved through the fields now carried a question I couldn't unhear. Who was he when he wasn't with me? The road narrowed as I turned down the lane toward Nancy's house. The marigolds at her fence were brighter now, small suns against the white paint. I parked beneath an old oak tree and sat for a moment, watching her through the windshield. She was kneeling in her garden again, humming softly, her hat tipped low to block the light. There was nothing threatening about her. That was the hardest part. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my shoes. She looked up immediately, shading her eyes to see me. When she smiled, it was the same. Open, unguarded. "Mrs. Beaumont," she said, recognizing me from before. "You came back." "I did," I said. "I wanted to thank you for the fern. It's still alive somehow," she laughed. "You've got the touch, then. Most folks overwater them." Her voice was warm and light, with that trace of small-town melody that made people trust her. I understood, suddenly, how Frank had found her, how easy it must have been to slide into her kindness and make it his stage. We stood in the sunlight for a while, talking about soil, pests, the stubbornness of roses. Hers were younger than mine, still learning to climb, still soft enough to bend without breaking. When she mentioned Frank's name again, it came without caution. "He stopped by yesterday," she said. "Brought me some paint swatches for the porch. You married a generous man, Mrs. Beaumont. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe." Then I smiled. "I suppose I did." She bent to pull a weed, oblivious to what her words were doing to me. "He's been helping me with the paperwork for the land sale. I told him I couldn't pay him back, but he said not to worry." She wiped her brow, eyes bright with gratitude. "Men like him are rare." "Rare?" I repeated. "That's one word for it." She looked up, sensing something in my tone. "Is everything all right?" I nodded, forcing a small laugh. "I'm fine. Just thinking about how small this town can be." "That's true," she said. "Secrets don't last long here." The irony nearly made me laugh. I stayed long enough to help her stake one of the new rose bushes. Her hands were sure, her touch gentle. She told me about her husband, how he died in the middle of a thunderstorm, how she still woke some nights expecting to hear his boots by the door. She spoke without self-pity, the kind of sadness that settles instead of screams. By the time I left, the sun had lowered, turning everything gold. Nancy waved as I drove away, the kind of wave you give to a friend. I lifted my hand in return. I wanted to hate her. I couldn't. Halfway home, I pulled over near the river. The water was low, slow-moving, catching the light like a dull mirror. I sat with the engine off, windows open, the smell of pine and mud thick in the air. My hands were shaking, not from anger, something deeper. It struck me then that Nancy wasn't the betrayal. She was the evidence, the mirror I hadn't asked for. When I got home, the house was dark except for the lamp in the den. Frank was in his chair, reading the paper. He didn't look up when I came in. "Where have you been?" he asked. Casual, the way people ask when they already have an answer in mind. "The nursery?" I said. "They had a sale. Buy anything good?" I thought of Nancy's hands pressing soil around her roses, the way she'd said men like him are rare. "Not yet," I said. "Still looking." He nodded, uninterested, and went back to his reading. I walked into the kitchen, washed my hands, and stared at the dirt swirling down the drain. It wasn't from the nursery. It was from her garden. From the place where Frank's lies had been planted and watered. Later that night, after Frank had gone upstairs, I took my journal and wrote by the soft light of the stove. The words came steady and clean. She tends her roses the way I used to. Believing beauty means safety. He will teach her otherwise. I will let him. I closed the book and sat very still, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just waited for the quiet to settle around me, firm as soil. When the clock struck 10, I turned off the light and walked out to the garden. The moon was sharp that night, the roses almost glowing. I ran my hand along one of the branches, feeling the thorns catch lightly against my skin. They didn't cut, not yet. I whispered into the dark, "She's not your enemy, Clara." Saying my own name aloud startled me. It had been years since I'd spoken it like that, like it belonged to someone real. Somewhere beyond the fence, a car passed, its headlights sweeping across the yard before vanishing. The night returned to its stillness. The roses swayed gently, brushing against one another in the breeze, whispering their soft, endless secret. I closed my eyes and let the sound fill me. It was the same sound I'd heard all my life, patience growing roots, waiting for the right season to bloom into truth. The letter found me when I wasn't looking for it. It slipped loose from a book I hadn't opened in years, a practical guide to southern perennials, the kind my mother used to keep stacked on the shelf beside her armchair. The envelope was yellowed at the edges, thin enough to see the shape of her handwriting pressed through. I knew it was hers before I even touched it. The book had fallen while I was dusting, scattering old pressed petals across the floor. Little ghosts of color. Pink, faded red, something that might have once been lavender. I bent to pick them up, and there it was, half hidden beneath a dried magnolia leaf. It wasn't sealed, just folded, as if she'd meant to send it but changed her mind. I carried it to the kitchen table, the late afternoon light falling across the words like it wanted to read them too. "My Clara," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I never found the right moment to tell you in person. You've always had a quiet spirit. Your father used to say you listen more than you speak, and maybe that's why people come to you with their troubles. But there's a danger in that, darling. Listening can turn into absorbing. Don't carry more than belongs to you." I paused there, my throat tightening. Her handwriting wavered slightly near the bottom of each line, the same way it had near the end of her life, when her hands had begun to tremble. "You've seen how I lived with your father. How I kept the peace, even when peace wasn't worth keeping. You called it patience. I called it survival. But silence can turn into a home, and before you know it, you're furnishing it with excuses. The words blurred as I read. I blinked hard, kept going. Promise me you won't build that kind of home, Clara. When something is wrong, say it. When something hurts, let it be known. I loved your father, but I never loved the woman I became for him. Don't repeat my mistakes. Speak, even if your voice shakes. Love should never require your disappearance. The last line was smudged, the ink gone soft with age. I touched it gently, tracing each word. Then I folded the letter and held it against my chest. The house was silent. Only the clock in the hall kept time, steady and indifferent. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the roses, a whisper through the leaves. I sat for a long while without moving, feeling my mother's voice stir the air. I had lived my whole life inside her warning, though I hadn't realized it until now. Every quiet meal, every careful answer, every lie I'd pretended not to see. They were her legacy. I stood and went to the window. The garden glowed in the dimming light, the petals bruised with the colors of sunset. The stepping stone near the fence caught a last slant of gold. Beneath it, the truth waited, patient as always. Frank came home just as I was putting the letter away. He called from the front door, his tone cheerful. "Clara, you wouldn't believe the day I've had." I slipped the envelope into the drawer beneath the dish towels. "I believe it," I said. He stepped into the kitchen, kissing my cheek as he passed. "The bank's a mess. Nothing but confusion down there. I might have to go in again tomorrow." "I see," I said. He leaned on the counter, looking at me closely. "You've been quiet lately." "Have I?" He smiled the smile he used when he wanted to test the temperature of the room. "Don't get that look. You know I worry when you go off in your head." I dried my hands and turned toward him. "Then don't give me reason to." He blinked, caught off guard. For a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw something raw flicker behind his eyes. Something that didn't like to be challenged. But just as quickly, he smoothed it away. "I'll take that as a compliment," he said lightly. "Take it however you want." He laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "You sound like your mother." That stopped me. He meant it as a jab, but it landed like a benediction. When he went upstairs to shower, I opened the drawer again and pulled out the letter. I read it once more, slowly this time, until the words felt etched beneath my skin. Then I slipped it into the pages of my journal. I didn't know what I would do yet, only that the silence had started to feel like a weight I couldn't keep carrying. The next morning, before Frank woke, I went out to the garden. The grass was wet, the air soft and heavy. I stood among the roses, my mother's letter in one hand, a cup of coffee in the other. The sun rose through the mist, pale and uncertain, just like me. I whispered to her, "I'm trying, Mama." The wind stirred, lifting a few petals from the nearest bush. They drifted across my feet and fell onto the damp soil. Small, fragile confessions. I didn't pick them up. That day, I didn't put the stepping stone back. I left it slightly askew, just enough for the edge of the paper beneath to catch the air. For the first time in years, I felt like the garden and I shared a secret that wasn't his. Frank found the letter first. Not the one from my mother. She was long gone by then. But my journal, the one I kept hidden under the old quilt in the linen chest. The same chest he'd bought me for our 10th anniversary, back when he still believed that gifts could cover the truth. It happened on a Thursday late afternoon. I was downstairs in the kitchen, washing fruit and thinking about nothing in particular, when I heard the faint creak of wood from upstairs, the sound of the chest lid lifting. I froze, my hands still submerged in the cool water. At first I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he was looking for towels, or those old tax papers he never could keep track of. But then came the second sound, the soft, final thud of the lid closing, the sound of discovery. A moment later, his voice. Calm, level, too careful. "Clara?" I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel. Yes? He came down the stairs one step at a time, his shoes landing with purpose. When he turned the corner into the kitchen, the air seemed to narrow around him. He held the journal open in one hand, the other resting on the banister like it might steady him. He looked at me the way men do when they think they're about to teach you something. What's this? My writing, I said. I can see that. His thumb brushed the edge of the page. Is it supposed to be a diary? Poetry? A confession? None of those. Then what? Truth. He laughed. Not loud. Just that small, sharp exhale that says he's amused and angry at the same time. Truth, he repeated. You think scribbling half-thoughts in a notebook makes them true? I think writing them down keeps me from disappearing. The words slipped out before I could stop them. He blinked, thrown off balance for just a second. Then his face hardened again. Where did you even get this nonsense? He asked. Patience, storms, lies. It sounds like you're writing about me. I am, he stared at me. The silence stretched long enough for the clock to chime once. Then he smiled, a cold, humorless thing. You've been going through my things. You went through mine first, I said. That's different. How? He straightened. Because I'm your husband. I turned off the sink and faced him. And that gives you permission? That gives me responsibility, he said, his voice rising. You don't understand how things work, Clara. You never have. You see one thing, and you make up the rest. I see enough. He moved closer, lowering his voice until it was almost a whisper. You've been talking to people. I've been listening, I said quietly. He slammed the journal shut, the sound sharp against the tile. That's the same thing. No, I said. Listening is what you do when you care what's real. Talking is what you do when you're afraid of it. He laughed again, but his eyes didn't match the sound. And what have you learned, Clara? That you're bitter? That you've wasted your life waiting for something better? You should be thanking me. For what? For giving you something to be. The calm inside me surprised even me. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just looked at him and said, And what are you, Frank? Without someone to lie to? He stepped closer. The smell of whiskey clung to his breath, faint but sharp. His face was close enough that I could see the small scar near his temple from the time he'd fallen off the ladder years ago. I used to touch that scar when we made up after arguments. I don't think I'll ever understand why. You don't talk to me like that, he said. I just did. He held my gaze for a long moment. Something in his eyes flickered. Anger, fear, disbelief. Then he turned, walked to the table, and set the journal down. You don't know what you're starting, he said. I think I do, he smirked, shaking his head. You've always had a wild imagination. It's not imagination if it's true. He turned back toward me, hands braced on the table. You think I don't know what you're capable of? You'd be lost without me. Who'd pay the bills? Who'd fix the car? Who'd make sure this house doesn't fall apart? I would, I said. And if it falls apart, maybe it should. For the first time in years, he didn't have an answer ready. The silence that followed felt different from the others. It wasn't heavy with fear or habit. It was open, clean. Outside, the wind was rising. I could hear it pressing against the windows, the sky darkening in that way it does before a storm. He glanced toward the window, then back at me. You're not leaving, he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't say I was. Then what? I'm staying, just not quiet anymore. He took a step closer. Careful, Clara. No, I said. You be careful. We stood there like that. Two people at the edge of something neither could name. Then he broke it, grabbing his coat from the hook. I'm going out, he said. Where? To clear my head. Try not to lose it, I said before I could stop myself. He froze for a heartbeat, then walked out the door without another word. The sound of it closing echoed through the house, long after the car engine started and faded down the road. I stood still until the quiet came back. The rain began not long after. Soft at first, then heavier. I walked to the table and picked up the journal. His fingerprints were faintly visible on the cover, smudged along the edges. I turned to a blank page and wrote, "He found the truth," and still called it fiction. Then another, "Storms don't destroy houses. They reveal where the rot already was." The pen moved easily now. My hand didn't shake. I could hear the rain hitting the roof, steady as footsteps. Somewhere out in the distance, thunder rolled low, patient and deliberate. I didn't know where Frank had gone or when he'd be back, but for the first time in years, the thought didn't scare me. I walked to the window. The sky was the color of slate, and the roses bent under the weight of the rain. The air smelled of wet soil and ozone. I whispered into the glass, "Let it come." And I meant it. The storm came in, heavy and strange, rolling low across the horizon like a warning. By nightfall, the wind had turned restless, pressing against the windows until the panes trembled. I sat by the kitchen table with a candle burning, the electricity flickering every few minutes. The smell of rain drifted through the cracks in the frame, sharp, metallic, alive. Frank still hadn't come home. Part of me thought he might stay away for good. Another part knew him better. Men like Frank don't leave the houses they've built. They return to remind you they still own them. I waited until the clock struck 9, then 10. The roads would be slick by now, the creek running high. I imagined his car lights cutting through the rain, his jaw clenched, hands tight on the wheel. He hated not being in control, and nothing humbles a man like weather he can't talk down. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I heard the sound, the tires on gravel, slow and uneven, then the slam of a car door, the crunch of boots. I didn't move from my chair. The front door opened hard, wind sweeping in with him. He stood there dripping, his hair plastered to his forehead, his shirt dark with rain. For a moment he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. "You locked the back gate," he said, breathless. "Why the hell did you lock the gate?" "I didn't," I said. He looked at me, suspicion flickering, then shrugged it off. He pulled his coat tighter, water dripping onto the rug. "Storm's worse than it looks," I nodded. "You're soaked." "I'll manage." He grabbed a towel from the rack and wiped his face, rough and quick. "You been sitting here all night?" "Yes." "Waiting for me?" "Waiting for the storm." He laughed under his breath, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "You always did love the dramatic." "Maybe," I said. "But I didn't start this one." He poured himself a glass of whiskey, hands still shaking slightly. The thunder cracked again, closer this time. The light flickered and went out completely. The house fell into dim candlelight and shadow. "Power's gone," he muttered. "It'll come back." He took a long drink, then set the glass down harder than he needed to. "You think I don't know what you're doing? You think I can't see it? I'm not hiding anything, Frank." He stepped closer, voice rising with the wind. "You've been talking to people. That woman. Nancy. You went to see her, didn't you?" I met his eyes. "Yes." The thunder rolled again, shaking the walls. He stared at me, like he couldn't decide whether to laugh or hit something. "You just can't help yourself, can you?" She deserved to know what kind of man was helping her. His jaw clenched. "And what kind of woman does that make you?" "The kind who's done being quiet." He took another step toward me, close enough that I could see the pulse in his neck. The candlelight flickered across his face, carving shadows that made him look older, meaner. "You think this is strength?" he said. "Digging around? Embarrassing me in front of people? I think it's truth. He turned away sharply, walking toward the door that led to the porch. The wind rattled the handle, as if daring him to open it. I'll fix the rail tonight, he said suddenly. It's been loose for weeks. I told you I'd get to it. It's raining, I said. He grabbed his toolbox from the closet. All the more reason to get it done. You never stop reminding me of what I don't finish. Frank, he was already outside. The rain hit him sideways, soaking him in seconds. I stood in the doorway, the cold wind cutting through my nightgown. He climbed the porch steps, muttering to himself as he bent to inspect the railing. The wood gleamed dark and slick under the lightning. You don't have to, he cut me off with a wave of his hand. Stay inside, Clara. I said I'll fix it. I watched as he set the hammer against the post, his movements unsteady. Another flash of lightning, then thunder, quick and loud. Frank, it's not safe. The words barely left my mouth before it happened. The hammer slipped. His foot missed the step. The sound of wood splitting. Then nothing but the rush of rain and the low, dull thud of something heavy hitting the ground. I ran out barefoot, the water cold against my skin. He lay at the base of the stairs, half in shadow, his face pale, eyes open but unfocused. Frank? I knelt beside him, my breath catching. He groaned, tried to move. Clara, don't. I pressed my hand to his chest, felt it rise, then fall. Stay still. He blinked up at me, rain running down his face, mixing with blood from a small cut at his temple. You took it off, he said weakly. What? The rail. His voice was barely a whisper. I swallowed hard. It needed fixing. He gave a soft, broken laugh, then winced. You always were patient. Too patient. The siren started somewhere in the distance. Faint at first, then clearer. A neighbor must have called. I didn't move. I just sat there in the rain, holding his hand as the light flashed again and again, each strike revealing the truth neither of us could take back. When the paramedics arrived, they pulled me away gently, voices calm and efficient. I watched them lift him onto the stretcher, watched his hand slip from mine. He was alive when they closed the doors. But something in me knew that the fall had already happened long before he stepped outside. I stood on the porch long after the ambulance left, the rain easing into drizzle. The broken rail swayed in the wind, tapping softly against the post. I reached out and steadied it, my fingers pressing against the splintered wood. The storm had passed, but the air was still heavy. I turned back toward the house, water pooling around my feet. The roses bowed low under the weight of the rain, their petals torn but intact. They'd survive. They always did. The hospital lights were too bright. That sterile kind of brightness that makes everything feel colder, even grief. I sat in the waiting room, still damp from the rain, my shoes leaving faint marks on the tile. The clock above the reception desk ticked with mechanical precision, each second stretching longer than the one before. They wouldn't let me see him right away. Head injury, they said. Broken ribs, possible concussion. He'd need scans. I nodded when they spoke, though the words barely reached me. The storm still roared inside my ears. When they finally called me in, the nurse smiled, that careful smile hospitals train you to use when they're not sure what kind of wife they're dealing with. He's stable, she said. You can talk to him, but keep it brief. Frank looked smaller in the hospital bed. The machines surrounded him like silent witnesses, their lights blinking soft and steady. His skin was pale, the veins on his hands blue under the thin blanket. He turned his head when he heard me enter. His voice was hoarse, but steady enough. Clara. I stepped closer. You're awake. Barely. He gave a faint, humorless smile. Guess I'm harder to get rid of than you thought. I didn't think that. He looked at me, eyes clouded with something between accusation and confusion. You left the rail off. It needed fixing. That's what you said before. I meant it both times. He exhaled through his nose, slow and shaky. They said it might have been worse if I'd fallen the other way. Might have broken my neck. I didn't answer. The beeping of the monitor filled the space between us. You think I deserved it? He asked finally. I don't think about it that way. How do you think about it? As gravity, I said. It pulls everything back to where it belongs. He closed his eyes, turning his face away. You sound like your mother. I know. For a while neither of us spoke. The rain had stopped, but the window still streaked with water, each drop catching the light as it slid down. When the nurse came to check his IV, she smiled politely at me, then turned to him. Detective's outside, she said. He'll need a statement when you're up for it. Frank frowned. Detective? She nodded. Routine. They have to ask about the fall. His eyes flicked to mine. You tell them anything? I shook my head. They didn't ask. When she left, he let out a small, bitter laugh. They'll think you pushed me. Did I? I asked quietly, his jaw tightened. You'd like that, wouldn't you? I don't like any of this. He turned toward me again, the lines around his mouth deepening. You'll see. They'll come asking questions. You'll tell them your little story, and they'll feel sorry for you. Poor, quiet Clara. I don't want pity, Frank. I want truth. He smiled faintly. Truth doesn't feed you. Neither did lies. The monitor beeped faster for a moment, then steadied. He closed his eyes again, breathing hard. The muscles in his jaw flexed, as if he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. I stood there a while longer, watching the small movements, the rise and fall of his chest, the twitch of his fingers. Every sound in that room, the hum of machines, the soft hiss of oxygen, felt louder than it should have. A detective eventually appeared at the door. He was young, polite, with tired eyes. He asked if I'd step outside for a moment. In the hallway, the air smelled of bleach and something faintly floral. I folded my hands together, still damp from nerves. Mrs. Beaumont, he said, we just have a few questions about what happened tonight. I told him the truth, that Frank had gone out to fix the railing, that I'd asked him not to, that the storm had been worse than either of us expected. I didn't add that I'd removed the rail days earlier, or that I'd stood there and watched the rain decide what kind of man my husband really was. The detective nodded as I spoke, scribbling a few notes. When I finished, he gave a small nod. Thank you, ma'am. We'll follow up if we need more details. He started to leave, then hesitated. If you don't mind me asking, how long have you and Mr. Beaumont been married? 40 years, I said. He smiled, not unkindly. That's something. Yes, I said softly. It is. When I went back into the room, Frank was asleep. I sat beside him, the chair cold under me. His hand lay on the blanket, open, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. I didn't take it. I just watched him breathe. Hours passed. The nurses changed shifts. The storm quieted completely. The world outside the window turned pale with dawn. When the doctor came in to check on him, I stood. Will he be all right? He'll recover, the doctor said. But it'll take time. The kind of fall he had, it shakes more than bones. I nodded, thanking him. But in my mind, I thought, it's already done the shaking. Before I left, I leaned close to Frank's ear and whispered, You'll come home soon. But it won't be the same home anymore. He stirred, half asleep, his lips forming my name. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered the bank statement, the phone calls, Nancy's soft gratitude. I walked out into the morning light, the air still damp, the scent of rain fading into something cleaner. The hospital doors slid shut behind me. I stood in the parking lot for a long time, the sky a washed-out blue above me. Somewhere across town, The roses were blooming again, heavy from the storm but unbroken. The morning the sheriff came, the light was too pure for what it carried. That kind of bright, untroubled blue that makes the world look like it's starting over. The air was still wet from last night's rain, heavy with the scent of pine and roses. You could almost believe nothing bad had ever happened in that yard. I was pruning the garden when I heard the first car roll up the drive. A deep, even engine, measured, official. Then, the crunch of gravel beneath tires, and the low creak of a car door opening. I didn't turn right away. I finished the stem I was cutting, placed the clippers down carefully, and only then looked toward the house. The sheriff was walking up the path, hat in hand. 2 deputies followed, their uniforms crisp, shoes dark with mud from the road. The way they moved told me what I already knew. This wasn't a visit. It was a reckoning. I brushed the dirt from my gloves and straightened. "Morning," I said. He nodded. "Morning, Mrs. Beaumont. Sorry to drop by like this." I smiled, faint and polite. "You're always welcome. The garden's open to everyone." He paused a moment, eyes flicking toward the porch, then back to me. "I'm afraid I'm not here for the garden, ma'am." He hesitated, searching for a softer entry that didn't exist. "Is your husband home?" "He is," I said. "Inside, by the window. He hasn't been far from that chair since the fall." The sheriff shifted the papers in his hand. "I'm sorry to say we've got a warrant." "For what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Financial misconduct. Fraud." A few other things that came up after the hospital reported the incident. He spoke the words gently, as if that might dull them. "We've been talking to some folks. People who say Mr. Beaumont's been handling their accounts. Money's gone missing. We followed the trail, and it leads here." The breeze picked up, brushing against the roses. They swayed lightly, unaware. "I see," I said. "I'll need to talk to him." "Of course." I took off my gloves, folded them neatly on the bench, and wiped my hands on my apron. As I led him toward the porch, the gravel crunched under our feet, steady and final. The 2 deputies stayed a few paces behind. Through the front window, I could see Frank exactly where I'd left him, blanket over his lap, coffee cup half drained on the table beside him, his eyes on the paper but not really reading. He'd been quieter since the fall, not softer, just quieter, like a man waiting to see whether the ground beneath him would stay put. When he saw the sheriff, his eyebrows lifted. He adjusted himself in the chair, his old charm flickering back to life. "Sheriff," he said, that practice ease sliding into place. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon. Everything all right?" The sheriff removed his hat, turning it slowly in his hands. "Afternoon, Mr. Beaumont. Sorry to trouble you. Mind if I come in?" "Not at all," Frank said, motioning toward the door. "Clara, be a dear and get the man some coffee." I didn't move. The sheriff stepped inside, hat against his chest. The deputies waited at the doorway, one holding the folded paper like a quiet verdict. "Mr. Beaumont," the sheriff began, "I'll get straight to it. There's been some concerns raised at the bank, transactions linked to your joint accounts, property sales under names that weren't yours. Some of those signatures came back as forged." Frank laughed lightly. "Now that's absurd. I've been in recovery for weeks. Hardly the picture of a criminal." The sheriff nodded, patient. "That may be, but the records go back further than your fall." I could feel Frank's eyes shift to me, sharp and sudden. "You called them." I met his gaze. I didn't have to. Something changed in his face then. Some flicker of realization that this moment had been growing for months, maybe years. He sat back, his expression caught between disbelief and pride. "Well," he said softly, "I suppose even roses have thorns." The sheriff nodded toward his deputies. "Sir, I need you to stand." "I'm injured," Frank said, his voice tightening. "We'll help you," one deputy said quietly. Frank took a long breath, his fingers clutching the arms of the chair. He pushed himself upright, slow but steady, the blanket slipping to the floor. The sheriff read him his rights. Calm, measured words spoken into the thick stillness of our living room. As the cuffs clicked, I saw his hands tremble for the first time. He turned to me then. "You could have stopped this." "No," I said. "You could have." The sheriff guided him toward the door. Frank hesitated at the threshold, the light spilling over his shoulder, making his profile sharp and unfamiliar. "You think you've won, Clara?" he asked. "There's no such thing as winning in marriage, only survival." I looked past him, toward the garden, where the roses leaned heavy in the sun. "I know," I said. "I just stopped dying from it." He opened his mouth to speak again, but the sheriff's hand touched his arm, gentle but firm. The deputies led him down the steps. The sunlight caught the metal of the cuffs, a flash of silver that looked almost like mercy. Neighbors would talk, of course. Word would move faster than the cars leaving my drive. They'd say I'd finally had enough, or that he'd gotten what was coming. They'd make it sound like an ending. It wasn't. It was the space between storms, the kind where the air feels too clean, too quiet, as if the world's still deciding what to do with itself. The sheriff turned before he reached the car. "We'll keep you updated, ma'am. There'll be paperwork, hearings, that sort of thing." "I understand," I said. He nodded once, then climbed into the car. The engine started, the gravel churned, and the sound faded down the road until there was only wind again. I stood there for a while, the smell of damp soil and exhaust mingling in the air. The porch boards beneath me creaked, the same sound they'd made under his feet every morning for 40 years. When I finally moved, it wasn't toward the house. It was toward the garden. The roses were gleaming, heavy with bloom, each petal wet at the edges. The pruning shears lay where I'd left them, the metal cool in my hand. I cut away a dead branch and laid it gently on the ground. Then another. And another. The work was slow, steady. I kept at it until the bush breathed easier, until the stems stood clear and strong again. By the time I finished, the sun was lowering, gilding the fence with light. My hands smelled of iron and green. I pressed my palms into the soil, feeling its warmth. Behind me, the house stood still, every window glowing gold in the fading light. It looked peaceful. Finally, honestly peaceful. I straightened, brushed the dirt from my skirt, and whispered into the quiet, "It's done." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The house was quieter than I'd ever known it, the kind of quiet that feels earned. Not the hush of fear or waiting, but the stillness that comes after a long, slow storm. It had weight to it, that silence. It settled over everything. The furniture, the walls, even the air itself, like dust that finally had permission to rest. The deputies had left tracks on the porch when they carried Frank's things to the car. I wiped them clean that evening, one careful stroke at a time. The boards creaked under my feet the same way they always had, but without his step beside mine, the sound felt different. Lighter, almost curious. Inside, the house was still warm from the afternoon sun. The radio played softly in the background, a song I didn't recognize. I let it fill the spaces where his voice used to be. I walked through each room slowly, the way you do when you're learning your own home again. The den smelled faintly of aftershave and whiskey, ghost of a habit that would fade soon enough. The framed photographs on the mantel seemed to watch me. Frank at 30, confident and alive. Eli at 10, his smile gap-toothed and pure. Me at 22, holding a bouquet of roses I thought meant forever. I didn't take them down. Not yet. There's a difference between moving on and erasing. In the kitchen, I found one of his coffee mugs still on the drying rack. The rim was chipped, just a little, from the time he dropped it during an argument about nothing that felt like everything. I washed it again, slow and deliberate, until the water ran clear and warm against my fingers. When I set it on the counter to dry, the last of the evening light caught its edge, turning the crack into a thin line of gold. I stood there for a long time, watching the sun move across it. Imperfection, illuminated. The phone rang once, breaking the silence. I let it. There was no one I wanted to explain things to, not yet. The neighbors would know soon enough. They always did. Later, when the light began to fade, I walked out to the porch with my journal. The roses were dark silhouettes against the horizon, their scent thick in the cooling air. I sat down on the step where he'd stood that morning, the wood still warm under my palms. I opened the journal to a fresh page. The wind lifted the corner slightly, eager. "This house has stopped listening for his voice," I wrote. "It's breathing differently now. Slow, even, unafraid." I paused, looking toward the road. It was empty, quiet except for the faint hum of crickets. Somewhere far off, a train passed, its whistle low and mournful. It reminded me of the first night we moved here, decades ago, when we'd lain awake listening to the same sound and dreaming of a life that never truly arrived. I wrote again. "Peace doesn't come with noise. It comes when there's nothing left to hide behind." I set the pen down and leaned back against the post. The air smelled of rain and cut stems. My hand still bore faint streaks of soil from the garden. I traced the small scar near my thumb, the one I'd gotten years ago, pruning roses too carelessly. Frank had teased me about it, called it my gardener's signature. Funny how some wounds close without ever really healing. I went inside to make tea. The kettle whistled softly, steady as breath. When I carried the cup back to the porch, the first stars were out, faint pinpricks scattered across a navy sky. The night felt patient, like it was giving me space to start small. For the first time in years, I noticed how the house sounded at rest. The pipes ticked quietly. The old refrigerator hummed. The walls sighed with the cooling air. All of it together made a kind of music, an ordinary, forgiving rhythm. I sipped the tea and let my thoughts drift to Eli. He hadn't called since the hospital. He'd said he needed time, and I hadn't pressed him. I knew what he was wrestling with. The confusion of loving a father who'd failed you and a mother who'd stayed too long. He'd come around when he was ready. Some truths you have to walk toward yourself. I thought, too, of Nancy. Her face had flashed through my mind when the sheriff read the charges. I wondered if she'd seen the news, if she'd sit in her garden tonight, realizing the man who'd promised to help her had only been helping himself. I didn't wish her pain. I just hoped she'd be free of him now, too. The moon climbed higher. The tea cooled. The roses shifted in the breeze, their leaves whispering against one another. I closed my eyes and listened. The stillness had a sound. It wasn't empty. Not anymore. It was full of small living things. The hum of insects, the pulse of the earth, the soft rustle of petals. It was the sound of a life quietly remaking itself. When I finally went back inside, I didn't lock the door right away. I stood there on the threshold, hand on the knob, letting the cool night air move through the hall. The scent of the garden followed me in, sweet, green, faintly wild. The clock struck 9. I turned off the radio and let the quiet settle again. Before I went upstairs, I paused by the window and looked out at the porch. The space where he'd stood was empty now, washed clean by sunlight and time. For the first time, I didn't see absence. I saw room. I whispered to the dark glass, "We're all right." The words came easy. Upstairs, I folded back the covers and slipped into bed. The sheets smelled of lavender and rain. The pillow beside me was untouched, but I didn't mind the emptiness. It was honest. As I closed my eyes, the house sighed once more. Old wood settling, pipes cooling, the heartbeat of something that had endured. The quiet wasn't lonely anymore. It was mine. By the time spring came again, the house had changed its breathing. The air inside was lighter now, moving through the rooms without hesitation, carrying the soft smell of lemon soap and rain-washed curtains. The silence that used to press against me had become something else, a companion, gentle and steady. I sold the house in March. Eli came down to help me pack. We worked in silence for most of the day, filling boxes with what stayed true and setting aside what didn't. He didn't ask much about his father, and I didn't offer more than he needed. That was our rhythm. Mutual mercy through restraint. When he came across Frank's old tool set, he paused. "Do you want to keep this?" "No," I said. "Let it go." He nodded, the understanding between us quiet but whole. The papers were signed 2 weeks later. The new owners were a young couple, full of plans and promises. They said they loved the garden. I told them to be kind to the roses, to give them sunlight and patience. I didn't tell them how much truth those roots had held. Some stories are better left to the soil. I moved into my mother's cottage by the river, a small white house with blue shutters and enough space for a second life. The first few nights there felt strange. Too much quiet, too much peace. After years of walking on the edge of someone else's temper, I'd wake sometimes to the sound of wind moving through the trees and, for a heartbeat, expect his voice. But it never came. Only the sound of leaves brushing the roof, soft and certain. One morning, Eli showed up with a car full of plants. "You said you weren't going to keep the old ones," he said, carrying them to the porch. "These are new," I told him. "Second bloom. We planted them together, white roses this time. Their roots were tender, their stems thin, but they'd find their strength. They always did. We didn't talk much while we worked. Just the scrape of shovels, the small rhythm of shared effort. When we finished, he brushed the dirt from his hands and looked at me with that quiet worry only sons carry for their mothers. "You sure you're okay out here?" he asked. "I'm sure," I said. "I like the quiet." He smiled. "You always did." When he left, I stood on the porch and watched his car disappear down the winding road. The light off the river shimmered across the windows, dancing over the walls like forgiveness. I walked through the garden, the new soil still dark and damp. A few buds had already begun to form, tiny points of green against the pale stems. I knelt beside them and pressed my hand to the earth. "I'm still here," I whispered. The wind carried the scent of water and pine. The sound of it moved through the branches, like someone breathing just beyond reach. I thought of my mother then, her letter, her voice, her warning. "Don't let silence become your home." I smiled. "It's not silence anymore," I said softly. "It's peace." Inside, I kept the journal on the windowsill. The last page remained blank until that afternoon, when I finally knew how to end it. The roses forgave before I did. They bloomed because they could, not because they were asked to. I think that's what living is, blooming where truth finally has light. I closed the book and left it open to dry, sunlight warming the page. Evening came slow. The air turned cool, the sky settling into a soft violet. I made a pot of tea and carried it outside, the steam curling into the fading light. The white roses glowed faintly in the dusk, their petals like small lanterns. From the porch, I could hear the steady rush of the river below, a sound without urgency, endless, forgiving. I sat and listened, feeling the world move around me without asking anything in return. It struck me then how much life can happen after an ending. Not loud or sudden, but slow and sure, like roots deepening in the dark. In that moment, I understood that peace isn't a gift someone gives you. It's the ground you learn to stand on after the storm is gone. I looked out at the garden one last time before the light faded completely. The roses shifted in the wind, whispering against one another, alive in their second bloom. And I thought, so am I. In the end, it wasn't revenge that bloomed in that garden. It was truth. And truth, I've learned, doesn't shout or break. It grows. Quietly, patiently. Until one day, it fills every corner of your life with light strong enough to show what was always there. The roses still bloom outside my window. Not red anymore. White now. Clean, simple, unashamed. When the wind moves through them, I sometimes hear the echo of the past. The sound of the porch boards, the soft hum of bees, the whisper of a life I've finally outgrown. Looking back now, I see it clearly. The silence that used to cage me has become my freedom. The stillness that once frightened me is where I finally found myself. Justice didn't come with handcuffs or headlines. It came with quiet mornings and soil on my hands. It came with the first breath I took that didn't have to ask permission. If you've ever had to rebuild after betrayal, if you've ever learned that peace can be stronger than anger, then you know how it feels to bloom again. Because in the end, truth always finds its season. And when it does, there's no stopping the bloom. If this story found a place in you, if you've ever stood in your own storm and come out quieter, stronger, and more yourself, leave a comment below. Tell me what you've survived, what you've grown through, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Every story has its reckoning and its rebirth.